Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. How we doing for the final day of AERA, folks? Who has found this to be an enjoyable learning experience for the last 4 days? I cannot thank you all enough for being a part of this conference. It's been beyond my wildest expectations, and that is because you all have showed up and you showed out. You've been phenomenal. You've been engaging. You've been thought-provoking. And I cannot think of a more fitting and appropriate way to prepare to close out our learning time together than to have the Wallace lecture by the one and only Dolores Delgado Bernal. Can we give her a round of applause, please? So one of the things that I have the honor of doing as AERA president is that every year you have 2 distinguished lectures that you can have someone provide. And that's not one you have to vet with the committee, or not one you have to go through a vetting process, but you get to select 2 people who you think their work has been transformative, that's been really useful for helping us theoretically, helping us practically. But really, for me, I was looking for someone who has really helped to expand my thinking. And as you all know, Gloria Ladson-Billings provided us with the distinguished lecture. And when I was thinking about the Wallace lecture, I said, who else can I find? And I thought of Dolores, because she has been someone whose work I have followed, I have watched, I have learned from, and it's been really informative in my own work, in my own thinking. And I can't tell you enough, Dolores, how important what you do is not only for my work, but for so many other folks. So I'm going to say less, and I'm going to let her come up here, but let me give you a quick bio. Dolores Delgado Bernal was a first-generation college student and an elementary school teacher. That's where you get my heart right there. Elementary school teacher in the Pasadena Unified School District. Oh, by the way, she got her PhD from UCLA. I just have to throw that in there, right? She was a faculty member at the University of Utah for 17 years, and then at Cal State LA, where she served as chair for the Department of Chicana and Latino Studies. And now she is a faculty member at Loyola Marymount University. She is considered by many folks across the country and across the world one of the leading scholars on race, equity, access, opportunity. So without further ado, please welcome me and give a big round of applause to Dolores Delgado Bernal, please.
Thank you, Tyrone, for that very kind, welcoming, and also let's give Tyrone another hand for he and Linda Tillman putting together a beautiful, that was just on time, Linda, look at that. And thank you, both of you, for the honor to be able to speak with all of you today. I appreciate all of you being here. Like Tyrone pointed out, it's been a really amazing week, a long week. So I appreciate you being here. I know I can tell some of you are still recovering from last night's Black and Brown party. Yep. I want to thank my husband. I'm thrilled that he's here today, Dr. Octavio Villalpando. He has been my academic partner and my partner in instigating good trouble for a long time. So I'm thrilled that he's here. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge the trauma that's going on outside the walls of this conference, the wars that will go on well beyond my lecture, and the call to stop the killing of innocent children in Gaza and release of hostages. For the next 40, let me just say, I was really nervous to do this, and all of a sudden, I feel calm. I see so many familiar faces and people who've created spaces in AERA for all of us, so thank you. For the next 40 minutes, I'd like to talk about not educational reform, educational policy, educational practice. I want to talk about educational research, which I think directly relates to reform, policy, and practice. Many of us argue that Feminista methodologies empower researchers to challenge dominant paradigms and create more inclusive research practices. and also fosters deeper connections, love, and well-being in the research process. Today, I hope you'll take two things away from my lecture. The first is a clear understanding of the trajectory, or the viaje, of Feminista methodologies. And the second is how they've contributed to knowledge production by centering Latinx knowledge within the research process. To leave you with that, I'm going to have to cover a lot and talk fast, so I'm going to give you a map of where I'm going. I'll first share my epistemological grounding, then point to some of the early Feminista paradigm shifts, and finish with specific examples of Feminista methodologies as practice, what that can look like. A couple of terms, I use Feminista interchangeably with Chicana, Latina, feminist. And for today's purposes, I'm going to use Latinx to refer to all genders. Those of you who know me won't be surprised that I'm going to contextualize this collective journey with a quote from the late feminista, lesbiana, philosopher, writer, Gloria Anzaldúa. It's a quote that I know has inspired some of us in the room to really be steadfast on this viaje with others. Necesitamos teorías that will rewrite history using race, class, gender, and ethnicity as categories of analysis, theories that cross borders, that blur boundaries, new kinds of theories with new theorizing methods. Anzaldúa's call has given me and so many others inspiration to disrupt research paradigms and create new kinds of methodologies. I wholeheartedly believe that the methodologies I'm talking about today are exactly the kinds of methods and theories that Anzaldúa was calling for. Like Anzaldúa and so many critical scholars of color, I know that my epistemological groundings come from my family and my ancestors. I learned about the strength and wisdom of brown women by growing up in the 1970s with a young Mexican-American mother who went back to finish high school when I was in elementary school. My mom, Josephine Delgado, served as my first example of a feminista, along with my sister, Josie AERA, who has been a teacher and school leader for over 30 years. I grew up listening to the cuentos of my grandma Eloise Delgado and grandma Micaela Bernal and my dad, John Bernal. Their stories led me to collect and record family histories, family oral histories. This was before the digital age, so I did it on the old cassette tapes. And from them, I came to understand the direct impact of the school-to-prison pipeline to my family. I came to learn the importance of sharing intergenerational knowledge and how to listen. This was important because I wasn't doing this at first. How to listen without really looking for some universal truth. I learned that I could, if I listened in that way, I could actually hear the strength, the creativity, and the resiliency. I learned, as Sheri Moraga said, to put faith in the language of the body, where the word is made flesh by the storyteller. Those oral histories that I did with my family led me to a history that was impacted by the racist, psychological, and behavioral research of the 1920s and 30s that found Mexican families like mine uneducable. Those pseudoscientific studies, along with social, cultural rationalizations, were the basis for the racist practices that kept my family in segregated Mexican schools, pushed out of schools, or forced into Americanization programs. I think most of us here know there's a long history of damage and trauma to Latinx, Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color caused by research grounded in white supremacy and colonization. That history, and really I would say the ongoing norms that want our research to be objective, neutral, and separated from the heart, is the reason that feminista methodologies are so needed. Some of the family members in these pictures I knew deeply. Others I never met. But who they were as farm workers, railroad workers, seamstress, and who they were as humble, resilient, and complicated individuals shaped who I am today and how I engage in the research process. I share these photos with you to demonstrate the kind of epistemological grounding that is foundational to feminista theorizing. So all of that and much more led me to my dissertation research, which focused on the resistance and leadership of women in the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts. That's where about 15,000 students walked out of high schools to protest, to demand a quality K-12 education. Sadly, many of their demands and their families' demands at that time are similar to what we hear over and over again from communities of color today. Eliminate racist teachers and administrators, stop the tracking, prepare bilingual teachers, bicultural teachers, and they demanded there be Mexican-American culture and history in the curriculum. So that was some of the first early demands for K-12 ethnic studies in the classroom, which, as we all know, is under attack throughout the country now. So in the mid-1990s, I collected oral histories from these 8 women who were the leaders of the walkouts. The knowledge that I gained from them about educational leadership specifically, but also how they talked to me, what they said, took me back to those family histories that I just told you. Relationships are important to qualitative research, particularly important to feminista research methodologies. And I've stayed in contact with these women over the years. In fact, I was just with them a few weeks ago as they lead the effort to bring awareness to the ways that Republican conservative politicians have successfully pushed the Smithsonian Museum to censor, to completely cancel an exhibit that was coming on Latino youth movements. So during Q&A, if anybody wants to talk more about that, I'm happy to talk about that. But back to this early research. At the time that I interviewed them, my formal methodological training did not provide all the necessary tools I needed to disavow research that was rooted in colonial logics and white supremacy. I am forever indebted to Black feminists and Chicana feminists outside the field of education who really shaped my early methodological training, and to Dr. Daniel Solórzano, my longtime mentor and friend, who allowed me to bring Chicana feminists into my dissertation in a time where that was not done in educational research. I have a quick story about that early research. When I was beginning the research, all excited, graduate student, I shared with one of my classmates, Chicano, male, older than me. He was actually of the walkout generation. And I shared with him that I was going to focus on Chicana leaders from the walkouts. And he very casually said to me, "That's a great idea, except there weren't any Chicana leaders, they were all male." Thank you. That was my reaction as a graduate student, right? Well, shortly after that, Danny directed me to Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, an old 1969 book about paradigm shifts in the natural sciences. And I'm thinking, why, right? Kuhn presented a model for a fundamental change in theories and scientific paradigms. And he argued that without major paradigm shifts, we may never understand certain scientific phenomena. So he gives the example how one of the scientists said to have discovered oxygen never saw it as oxygen. He wasn't able to see what others were later able to see after there had been a paradigm shift. So the paradigm of my classmate didn't allow him to see Chicanas as leaders. I argue today that the research paradigm shift that Chicana Latina scholars have offered allows us to see and understand the education and educación of Latinx communities differently than dominant research paradigms. Yeah. So shortly after my dissertation, I began to articulate a paradigm shift when I published using Chicana feminist epistemology in educational research. In that article, I drew from Strauss and Corbin's concept of theoretical sensitivity to formulate the now often cited and used concept of cultural intuition, which is an evolving concept that is on the basis of a feminista epistemological framework. So based on that early research of the women from the walkouts, I theorized how my experiential knowledge as a first-generation college student, as an elementary school teacher, my cultural history, those family stories again, and Chicana feminist writings all shaped my methodological approach. I did it after the fact. I didn't realize it when I was doing this process. And I outlined basically what I will admit was a somewhat limited ideas on what it meant to use a Chicana feminist epistemology in research. I operationalized cultural intuition as something that's achieved. So you're not born with this, despite the word intuition. Sometimes people think that. But it can be nurtured through personal experiences, ancestral wisdom, community memory, professional experience, the literature on and about Chicanas and Latinas, and the analytical process that we engage in when we are in the center of that process. Now, as I began this paradigm shift, I was building on the knowledge of Chicana education faculty who were already paving the way. Not explicitly in feminista methodologies, but with their research in higher ed, bilingual ed, literacy, community empowerment, social identities. Chris Gutierrez, who was honored this week by AERA, Ángela Valenzuela, Silvia Hurtado, Patricia Gándara, Aida Hurtado, Concepción Valadez, Concha Delgado Gaitón were some of the scholars paving the way. So the journey that I'm talking about today is very intergenerational. Around the same time that I published this first Harvard Ed article, some of my contemporaries were also theorizing similar epistemological and methodological paradigm shifts. Sofia Vienes in 1996 published The Colonizer Colonized, Chicana Ethnographer in Harvard Educational Review. An important takeaway from that early piece was the way she urges researchers from marginalized communities who were more and more working within the communities we're from to recognize our position as border crossers, but also how our histories and our identities are entangled in the workings of domination, and cautioned us as we're both insider and outsider in that research. And then in 2000, Cynthia Dillard published her seminal article on an Andarcan feminist epistemology. And she disrupted the taken for granted notions surrounding the very goals and purposes of educational research. She offered us an Andarcan feminist epistemology, which embodies distinguishably different cultural standpoint grounded in the experiences of Black women. These and other publications were paving the way, and they were really legitimizing analytical, conceptual, and representational tools grounded in our systems of knowing that were not yet common in educational research. They were offering the beginnings of a paradigm shift for how we recenter the knowledge of women of color in research. Like I said, the journey is intergenerational. So let me fast forward a few years to another generation of scholars who were continuing to build on those paradigm shifts. In 2009, then doctoral students, Dr. Lindsay Perez Uber, Vero Velez, Maria Malagon, they invited me to sit down with them and talk about the methodological messiness and the feminista theorizing that they were each doing in their dissertations. Well, from 2000 to 2008, I was having babies, breastfeeding babies, and dealing with toddlers with Octavio, so I welcomed this conversation. I remember we met at the Critical Race Studies and Education Association conference. That year, it was held in Tucson, Arizona, and they held it half the time at the university campus and half the time at the high school. And we met in a high school classroom in a circle, And that was the beginnings of our co-authored article, along with Lola Calderon, who wasn't there at the time, a Chicana feminist epistemology and education revisited, building on ideas a generation later. In that article, we examined how over 20 education scholars had applied, critiqued, and expanded early ideas of Chicana feminist epistemology and cultural intuition. The many ways that cultural intuition had been taken up was significant because collectively the scholars demonstrated that drawing upon our unique ways of sources of knowledge is a valuable means of theorizing and engaging in the research process. And what I think was probably most provocative was the idea of how cultural intuition had been expanded in ways that queered, indigenized, decolonized, and spiritualized the research process. Today, there are numerous Feminista methodological approaches, more than I could put up in my little flower diagram here. So what I'd like to do is highlight two specific examples of Feminista methodologies and demonstrate how they center different forms of Latinx knowledge. I'll focus on Pláticas and Critical Race Feminista, partially because there's a good amount of scholarship that literally just published, and I think they provide really good examples of how these methodologies have been extended. Okay, remember I said I want you to take away from my lecture the ways in which these methodologies have contributed to knowledge production centering Latinx knowledge. So I'm going to throw a lot out at you right now to get to that point, so hold on. Let me start with pláticas. For those of you that don't speak Spanish, pláticas, the literal translation are conversations, informal conversations. When I was at the University of Utah as faculty, I would very often work with a group of doctoral student advisees, and we would meet at my house or one of the students' houses. And like any good meeting in someone's house, it took place around the kitchen table. And so after a few kitchen table pláticas about pláticas, we began to realize there was an absence of scholarship that really went into detail about pláticas as a research method or methodology. Most of the graduate students were working on their proposals, so they had a real need to articulate Chapter 3, methodology, and also for the upcoming IRB, who at that time was completely unfamiliar with what pláticas are. As a result of those kitchen table pláticas, one of my then doc students, Cindy Fierros, and I began to delve into the literature. And we learned that pláticas had been used in social science research since the 1970s, especially in social work and in mental health studies. Now, the use of pláticas in Hispanic-focused research emerged as a result of researchers feeling like qualitative methods, particularly ethnographies and surveys, I'm not sure why those didn't really work with Hispanic participants. So the early research used pláticas as more of an entryway or as small talk before the real research began. In our 2016 article, we offered specific contours to define a pláticas methodology, and we really we helped to change that conversation of the use of pláticas, shift it from small talk to a valid, culturally grounded methodological approach. Now, since that publication, there's been a clear increase in the number of dissertations, theses, articles, chapters that have been published. In a ProQuest search in March of 2021, there were 234 published dissertation and theses that engaged Chicana Latina feminist pláticas. 234. 2 years later, in 2023, there were 604. And today, there are 756, which is more than a threefold increase in 3 years, and that doesn't include articles and chapters, just theses and dissertations. And I think this shows the growing interest and really the commitment to develop the methodology, especially with early career scholars and educators. In fact, those of us who engage in this methodology often have graduate students, early career scholars, but especially graduate students from across the country reach out to us wanting some guidance on how to engage in this methodology. And I would say we also hear a lot from colleagues who are unfamiliar with the methodology, but maybe have graduate students who want to engage in this methodology. Sometimes we'll get asked, how are they different from semi-structured interviews? Well, definitely the growing body of research makes that very clear. What I'd like to do to you today is just name 3 important contours of this methodology. The first is it's culturally grounded and body, mind, spirit of researchers and collaborators. That means that it's a relational methodology. It's often intergenerational, with nuances that are related to language, so Spanish, English, very often in Spanglish. There's very often the incorporation of or the sharing of cultural practices, chisme, consejos, respeto. And the second important contour is the role of solidarity, vulnerability, and reciprocity. Both researcher and collaborator are understood as knowledge producers. That's key to this methodology. The conversation is two-way, and the researcher and the collaborator are vulnerable. We don't usually see researchers being vulnerable in something like semi-structured interviews. And solidarity involves reciprocity, and that means that the researcher is not neutral or objective. They come with their political convictions. They want to disrupt intersectional racism and create more equitable environments. So not neutral, not objective. And then the third is it's a potential tool of healing and resistance. Over and over again, we hear that both the researchers and the collaborator experience pláticas as part of a healing process. So there's tears that are shared, there's laughter, there's joy. And again, that is two-way. And so the researcher often empathizes, but sharing their experiences that might actually mirror what collaborators are sharing. So these 3 contours or principles of pláticas leads me to that growing body of literature that I just mentioned. Just last year, in late 2023, Dr. Socorro Morales, Tanya Gaxiola Serrano, Alma Itze Flores, and I curated a space in QSC to add to that body of literature and to explore the many ways in which this methodology is being extended and theorized by scholars. The 2-year process of working on this special issue was really powerful, not just because I got to work with these amazing women, but because there were 70 submissions. We couldn't include them all, but we got a glimpse at the ways in which this methodology is being employed and extended and used. The results that are included in the studies provide insights that I believe, and I think each of the authors would agree, findings and results that wouldn't be available without this methodology. Let me quickly mention 2 articles that are examples of how collectively the contributors are deepening and extending Feminista perspectives, and more specifically, Plática's methodology. The first is Mayra Puente and Dr. Veronica Velez. They merged Feminista, Pláticas, GIS software, and census data. And they developed what they call Platicando y Mapeando methodology, a talking and mapping methodology. Their study of college students in opportunities of rural Latinx youth from the San Joaquin Valley provides insights as to how Pláticas with 15 high school students added significant layers to their data that can't be found in census data. So the maps they created look very different when they actually included the students' socio-political context of the spaces they inhabited with their families. And when they became co-cartographers, again, there's that co-collaboration of knowledge and shared in the meaning process the high school students did. And so I'll share with you their top map accurately, overlays the percentage of Latinx in this rural population and the low percentage of bachelor degree attainment. But their second map, when the youth included their knowledge, their experiences about the spaces, it gave a different take in that it demonstrated why the low attainment rates based on what was going on around them, the political context, including the number of Trump voters in the rural area that they lived. So I know I'm not doing justice to this research, so I want to direct you to that article, but also want to say that they both received Division J award this year for this article here at AERA. Another example of how scholars are extending a Platica's methodology comes from Ángel González, Roberto Orozco, and Sergio González. And they really make a significant departure from much of the Platica's work being done by drawing from Joteria scholarship, Latinx queer scholarship, to unsettle heteronormativity and cispatriarchy. What they do is they draw from their respective empirical research projects with queer and trans Latinx students, college students, to offer what they call queer Platicas. Now, they note that the original contours that Cindy and I outline didn't quite capture the methodology they were engaged with in their individual research projects. In fact, they point out that the familial traditions of platicando that Cindy and I talk about and embrace are experienced very differently by queer family members when those platicas are laced or deeply embedded with heteronormativity. So they theorized queer platicas and conceptualized 5 new contours shown here in their diagram. What I want to note is that their work is significant to naming and centering one's queer identity and queer experiences as researchers and as collaborators. And it's the root of the epistemological perspective they bring to the research. Their work really points to the fact, and I think this is important, that there are so many different knowledges, systems of knowing in Latinx communities. All the contributors to the special issue offer a methodological disruption by challenging Western colonial assumptions, and the articles leave the door open for scholars to decide if some version of a Platica's methodology provides more culturally relevant ways to collaborate with and advocate for different Latinx communities via our research. I said I would talk about 2 Feminista methodologies. I've talked about Platicas. I want to talk just briefly about critical race feminista praxis, or also called critical race feminista methodology. The other part of my academic journey that I haven't talked about is how I came to be introduced to critical race theory and my early training as a critical race scholar. I'm not going to talk about that, but suffice it to say, I first started thinking about how to merge CRT with feminista theories back when I was a graduate student. And in 1997, Danny and I wrote an article where we were struggling with what to call this joining of these 2 perspectives. And we actually called the fusion critical race gender theory. But it really didn't quite capture what we were trying to do and in alignment with feminista theories. I should also note that around the same time, legal scholars are beginning to write about femcrit, bringing feminists of color and critical race theory together. Well, we kind of left it at that, right, Danny, for a little while. Years later, I was at the University of Utah, faculty of the University of Utah, doing research with Dr. Enrique Aleman and more than a dozen graduate students, most of them Chicanas Latinas. And we were engaged in this university school partnership called Adelante. It was designed to specifically challenge and counter the educational system's failure to educate Latinx students. The partnership brought college student mentors of color to the elementary school on a daily basis. It took elementary school students to the university on a regular basis. There was professional development for teachers, advocacy work for parents. Dr. Aleman and his family and his children went to that school. They lived in the neighborhood. Octavio and I lived in the neighborhood. Our sons went to that school. When it came time to write this book, we had a need to articulate how over this 10-year period working in this research in the community, how it was shaped by both CRT and Feminista. And to do that, we reminded ourselves what each of the frameworks offered us. CRT provides a framework to examine the ways racism and white supremacy shape educational policies and practices, the more structural. Feminista simultaneously, Feminista theories forefront the body-mind-spirit connection by addressing how individual and also collective experiences within educational spaces, educational racist spaces, are inscribed upon our bodies, our spirits, our minds. So, CRT allows us to understand institutions as being embedded with racism. Feminista theories allow us to examine lived experiences, especially the ways in which those experiences are messy and complicated, either in our lives or in the research process. Both of these frameworks offer numerous analytical tools to engage in research. I have just a few of them up there. And when you merge the two theoretical frameworks, it provides ways to engage in research and to understand phenomena in ways that neither approach alone allows you to do. Let me talk about some kind of examples to try to make sense of this. The concept of convivencia, it has to do with living together, forging relationships, creating a union, being aware of others' humanity, something very often ignored in methodological discussions. Our convivencias and the partnership allowed the Adelante team members to bring their body, mind, spirit to the advocacy research so that they developed long-term relationships with students, parents, and college student mentors. And the convivencia was multidimensional. Napantla, this concept has to do with liminal spaces, borderland spaces. And so methodological Napantla is that in-between space, those messy spaces of discomfort, contradiction, messiness in our research. So when parents who shared convivencias needed un favor, a letter because they were applying for citizenship, negotiating school policies, maybe translating documents, it meant prioritizing their personal needs that contradicted the ever-present demands of an R1 institution. There was some methodological Napantla. At other times, we had to make sure our work as activist scholars stayed focused on what was most important to parents as they negotiated the racist nativist climate. At one point, the Spanish dual immersion, there was under threat of cancellation, and we shared that with the parents, and they agreed that was really bad news, but they demanded that we collectively respond to a greater concern about the surveillance of their sons' brown bodies via a racist discipline policy on the playground that was happening on a daily basis. Methodological Napantla also helped us make sense of the uneasiness we felt in the asymmetrical reciprocity. We often talk about reciprocity, but it's usually asymmetrical between collaborators and researchers, and also the contradictions of working with and within racist institutions, both higher ed and K-12 in this case. So though we were able to leverage a lot of resources and our privilege to positively alter school culture, curriculum, academic opportunities, and we write about that in the book, the idea of racial realism points to how the material realities of most of the students and their families, their immigration status, their socioeconomic status, remain the same. I remain uncomfortably cognizant of the fact that research, even when guided with critical race feminista methodologies, often benefits scholars, even activist scholars, in qualitatively and quantitatively different ways than it benefits students and communities of color. But I do remain hopeful, particularly with the most recent critical race feminista methodologies that have been taken up in this special issue edited by Lindsay, Vero, and Maria. Most of the articles have already dropped. I think there's a few more that are still coming out. There was a beautiful, beautiful panel yesterday on this special issue, and there were lots of takeaways, but there's 2 takeaways that I'd like to share. First is the collection of scholarship, like the journey that I've been talking about, is interdisciplinary and intergenerational, with really early career scholars leading the way. And similar to the work being done with Pláticas, critical race feminista methodologies are intersectional and more inclusive, and particularly innovative in the ways they merge qualitative and quantitative methodologies. There's a sense of energy that this work is looking ahead to address the socio-political climate of anti-CRT, anti-DEI, anti-ethnic studies, and also looking ahead to increase our Afro-Latino accountability, to draw upon one's detribalized indigenous ways of knowing, and to make the linkages with anti-colonial struggles across the globe that are so needed today. Second, this work is different because healing and well-being are always at the forefront. It addresses the ways in which students, their parents, their communities heal from racist educational institutions that have committed spirit murder against them over and over again. Key to this is love, not a mushy love, not a romantic love, but an anti-racist love. A love that moves us away from domination and towards practices of liberation. Let me conclude by returning to Ansaldúa and even Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn called on us to create new paradigms in order to see that which is unseen in dominant paradigms. Ansaldúa called on us to interpret phenomena by creating new kinds of theories and new methodologies. Not only have feminista scholars responded to these calls, but they've done so via a collective intergenerational journey. I would say an essential consideration in intellectual work, particularly when you're disrupting paradigms, is that it be done in collaboration, not in isolation, as academia would very often like us to believe. There are now multiple generations of scholars, many of whom have been mentored by Danny, who have nurtured and expanded the early ideas of using a feminista epistemology in educational research. I know what I've presented is a lot and pretty dense, especially if this is new to you, but I hope you do take away a clear understanding of that trajectory, of these methodologies, and how they've contributed to knowledge production that moves us closer to the goal of dismantling racism. The last thing I want to share, reveal, is my superpower. In preparing my comments, I quickly realized I was talking an awful lot about myself. And I reminded myself that my superpower is not my intellect, it's not my research. My superpower is my ability to connect with, tag along with, and learn from anti-racist scholars. Anti-racist scholars who draw from their families, their experiential knowledge, their Latinx communities, and their socio-political convictions. So because of that superpower, I've had a chance to learn from and collaborate with brilliant scholars throughout my career. These are but a few of the chingonas. There are so many more whose collective body of scholarship pushes me, pushes all of us to ask new questions, center brown bodies, include the voices, the knowledge, and experiences from Latinx students and communities in order to advance anti-racist research agendas. I thank all of them, and I thank all of you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure what happens now, Tyrone.
So powerful, so rich, so informative. Can we give Dolores another round of applause, please? We're not going to let you get away that soon. So we got 2 microphones on each side of the aisle. So if you have questions, please step into the aisle, and we want to see if folks can engage in some Q&A while we have time.
I think you have to get to a mic. So we'll start there and then go ahead and move over to this other one.
Hi, I'm Christina Nader, third-year doctoral student at Texas A&M University. Thank you so much, Dr. Delgado Bernal. I really appreciate early on in the lecture, as well as early on in your experience, you mentioning that you maintain contact with your study participants from your dissertation, which I think is a fantastic example of like decolonial methods and approaches. And as someone who is close to data collection, can you speak to the strategy or the strategy behind that, or was it strategy at all? And how did it happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there's probably lots of ways that people in this room can answer that question because it depends what the context is. I'm looking at Shireen, who maintains contacts with students she taught in high school well over a decade ago, 15 years ago maybe. I'm thinking of Vero's work with parents in the Pasadena area, and so those kinds of contexts are different. With these women, what was really interesting is right afterwards, I wrote them and would email. Okay, remember this was a long time ago, so digitally it wasn't as easy to keep in contact either. and kind of didn't have contact for a few years. And then we reconnected when I came back to LA. There was the 50th anniversary of the walkouts. Now I seem to see them regularly. I get Happy Mother's Day texts we exchanged with them. And because they're all retired, and because they are activists, and again, and really involved in this bringing awareness to what has happened at the Smithsonian Museum, they've kind of got their hands in everything, and they have time right now to be out there. We've also lost one of the 8 that's up there. So yeah, those relationships are important, and I think you ask about strategy. I think keeping some kind of strategy in mind, but I think it's just going to be so different depending on the kind of qualitative work and what those relationships are, what ages the people are. I will say the Adelante kids, we called the first group of kindergartners Los Primeros. Those kindergartners are now 23 and 24 years old. And in January, Dr. Enrique Alemán, Socorro Morales, and Silvia Mendoza, we started working on contacting them, and again, so much easier on social media. But a number of them came forward, and we did a handful of interviews in January and February with them. So we interviewed them as kindergartners, 4th graders, when they started high school, and now as early 20-something years old. So we're hoping to do some more of that. I think you were going to ask a question. Yes, if you want to get to a microphone. I think they're just asking that you be on a microphone. And then while she's getting ready to ask that question, I met a gentleman, yes, that you were telling me about your IRB experience in Texas. Who am I looking at? No? Yeah, I'm just thinking I'd love for the audience to hear about that comment afterwards. Go ahead.
Yeah, we met yesterday morning talking about, in my work, you taught me a lot about the metaphysical responsibility.
A little closer.
You taught me a lot about the metaphysical responsibility based on that session we had yesterday morning. So I'm curious if you've ever had a type of metaphysical experience as you've been unraveling the Plática methodology and even, the notions of this feminista praxis that you've been pushing forward. So if you had time and capacity to discuss a metaphysical experience you've had as you've been unraveling all of this.
Can I hear yours first?
I don't know if you've been into an archive, specifically I engage with sterilization records. I know this is going to sound very bizarre, but the young girl that I discussed, Concha, yesterday, the first time I engaged with her record, and when I read the newspaper that she got sterilized, and part of it was because she ran away with a boy, I couldn't help but think about my sister. My sister was so bad. It was delicious. And I thought about it, and I'm like, oh man, Concepcion got punished because she fell in love. And I couldn't stop thinking about her. And I know this is going to sound really morbid when you think about a sterilization conducted on a 16-year-old girl against her will. You think like really gross things, you imagine how it all could have went down. And I ended up just falling in love with her. And I think I would see her in books. I met a new neighbor, her name was Concepcion, and she would just keep coming up in all of these weird ways. And that was, I think she kept haunting me because she really wanted me to make it be known that she was around. And I think that was my experience with that, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think what you're speaking to, so you do archival research, but I think what you're speaking to is relationships again, right? It does have to do with relationships of those who've passed and ancestors. And so what that metaphysical looks like depends on the kind of research we're doing, because you're dealing with people who are gone, but the archives are there, and how do you reinterpret it? Some of us are working with kids and college students and families, and so that relational component that you're talking about is key no matter what. I think for me, a lot of the relationships, particularly in the 10 years that I work at the partnership at the University of Utah, I was constantly taken back to my childhood, but also because my kids were there in the neighborhood. In fact, my son didn't tell me he was my one son, my youngest, was quite rambunctious. He was one of the kids who was actually having the racist policy against he and some of the other boys on the playground. And so those kinds of relationships and who we interact with and where it takes us to in our own memories it's important in this process. Oh, don't worry.
First of all, thank you for calling me out, Dr. Delgado. So I'll start by saying that my name is Gustavo Perez. I am a first-generation Mexican-American. My parents are from Zacatecas, Mexico. And I'm a recently minted PhD with Texas Tech University. So I was sharing, and I work for College Station at our Extension campus in McAllen. And I was mentioning that it took me 10 years to do my dissertation. One, because I was probably not a really good student, but I went through 4 different chairs, and I just thought it was part of the process. And I was trying to find a methodology that I could honor my parents. I didn't know I was going to be a professor. I was saying, hey, this is my chance to complete their journey, to honor my parents' struggle coming from Mexico as immigrants. And if this is my one shot, I want to honor them with stories. And I was trying to find a way to really capture their stories. So I was explaining to my chair, I want to talk to people. Quiero platicar. I want to find people that have had my same experience as me. I'm an engineer, and I went through some struggles. I want to tell their stories in a way that really honors their struggles. And she said, well, you want to do a semi-structured interview? And I said, well, no, not really, because it is structured, but not in the way you're thinking about it. I need more freedom. I want to drink a beer with them in the backyard, right? And drink a beer and just have a conversation like we do, right? To get to the heart of it, right? To loosen up the conversation, right? If it's rigid, it's not gonna happen, right? And so once after 2-3 beers, if you know you're Hispanic, you're gonna let it out, right? So she said, well, you wanna do platicas? I go, no, platicas. And so I came across a wonderful Contour article, and I said, that's what I wanna do. And I had to defend it in many different ways to bridge that, right? And so I was mentioning to Dr. Delgado right now, like just briefly, like, thank you. And it made a big difference in my study.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, you IRB came to approve you as semi-structured. And what's really interesting is when I was at the University of Utah, none of these publications were out there. All this amazing, that special issue, all this amazing scholarship wasn't there. And so I will admit, I told my students, like, we need to get it through, and they don't understand it. We'll do semi-structured. Folks don't have to do that anymore. What I guess I would encourage graduate students is the scholarship is there. Like always, folks of color got to be twice as good and do twice as much. So you just have to be diligent and rigorous in making sure you're citing the scholarship. When folks say, what'd you say, platigas or however, what are platigas? But the scholarship is there, and it's solid. It's in strong journals. There's research, there's findings, it's there. And so I think we need to educate the IRBs out there on these different kinds of methodologies. Yeah, go ahead.
Hola, everybody. Dr. Angel Gonzalez, pronounced he, they, ella. Doctor, I just want to say thank you for the pathways you've created. The result of the work that you highlighted actually came about, I remember at ASH 2019, your opening speaker, and at that time I was going through the IRB process, and I had semi-structured interviews and focus groups, and I remember clearly you told the audience, but I feel like you told me, like, listen to your cultural intuition. And I went back home and redid chapter 3, and my chair was like, what are you doing? But and shifted all over to testimonio and queer chisme as instead of focus groups. And that not only transformed the work that I do, but it transformed me. So I just want to thank you for that, right? That ability to see beyond what we've been told to think and be has really transformed a lot of us. We're a testament to that. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. And I think sometimes in academia, there's egos. We have egos. And there's this thing about, like, I own this, or, cite me and things like that. I think what is exciting to me about this work is really how it gets taken up, taken apart, and redone. And that's what we want, right? We want to have the next generation building on and expanding in ways. Like I say, when I look back at that 1998 article, I think, oh my gosh, there's so much missing. That's okay. We put our stuff out there, and then what we want is other folks to build and extend and critique. Yeah.
Hello, doctor and everyone. My name is Erika Stauffer Reyes. I'm a Mexican doctoral student here at Penn. I'm an outsider to academia here, even though I'm in my 5th year, but I'm still an outsider, right? Because I'm from Mexico, and I'm from the northern state of Chihuahua. And I'm saying this because it's important to provide context to the question that I'm going to make. As an outsider to academia here, I'm still grappling to understand how I fit into Chicana Feminista methodologies. And my question is, you briefly mentioned pláticas as methodology, and then you went on. And I haven't been able to find a distinction between plática as a research method and as a methodology. And I have been reading and doing my homework. I don't know if it's just the ADHD that so I don't know. Anything that you can tell me, tell the audience about how you might distinct pláticas as a method or methodology. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important. And if we just think about method and methodology, different. Method is how you collect the data. Methodology is all the theory that guides that shapes that. The pláticas can be used as just a way to collect data, but what scholars have done, I think, that are using this, they're bringing in feminista theories that shape what they're doing, how they analyze, how they approach their research. It's all there. In that special issue of pláticas, there's a couple of pieces that really go into detail of why it's a methodology. So I'm going to direct you to back to that special issue and take a look at some of the pieces there that talk about this is why it's methodology and not just a data collection tool, like an interview, like a semi-structured interview. Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And it takes multiple readings, right? We need to go through it again and again.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. At the center of your work, what I see is the power of community and the power of collective thought. The same thing I think was visible in another presidential session that was led with Jeff Duncan Andrade and his fifth grade students. The question that I have is, if in your work following your dissertation, it's this collective sort of collaborating, how can we train at the dissertation phase to better do that? Because currently the system, it's a lonely process. And how can we disrupt that in the making of scholars?
Well, join Danny Solorzano's RAC at UCLA would be one way. But there are, when I was at the University of Utah, there were the students that were involved in that project, they were actually worrying that, can we do this because will somebody say we're cheating because we're both, we're working on this. They were doing an after-school ethnic studies program with fifth graders, but they were both doing separate dissertations and collecting data in that space. Now, their research questions were different, but they shared that space and they shared the constant questioning and thinking and what are we doing? And I think in that process, it's also up to those of us who are faculty, who are chairs, to help create those spaces that allow for that collaboration to happen. Because even the dissertation should not be an isolated endeavor. Absolutely not. Yeah. And so up to us partially as faculty, assistant, associate, full professors, but also if that's not how your faculty mentor works, you can find the spaces of other folks, of other graduate students where you're sharing each other's work, you're brainstorming with each other, you're helping each other. And so it kind of needs to come from both ways. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hello, my name is Kirti, and I am a research analyst at a Philly-based nonprofit research organization called Research for Action. I'm coming into this as very much a novice who doesn't know a lot about Feminista methodologies, but something that I've been getting interested in and I'm seeing a lot more of is participatory action research and participatory design research. And so I'm just curious about how you see participatory methods as aligning with and relating to Feminista methodologies.
Yeah, absolutely. In the second special issue, the Critical Race Feminista methodologies, did Vero disappear? I was going to ask. Okay, I was just going to ask who the author is. So in Ruth, what's Ruth's last name? I know, but I don't remember her last name. So in the second special issue, the Critical Race Feminista methodologies, those scholars are engaging in different kinds. So, and one of them specifically is on par. And so when I was mentioning the GIS software and Feminista, or the PAR and Feminista, there is just folks who are, again, taking these and merging them together. And so I would really recommend you take a look at that. With the Pláticas, which is different, but I'm blanking on, give me a second, on Alma's article on portraiture. Bringing portraiture, bringing PAR, bringing these together is part of what folks are doing. So if this rings with you, then how does PAR, which is already there, what would Feminista add? And that's kind of what we have been asking ourselves. We're not just going to do it for the sake of doing it or it's in the name, but what is it? What does PAR not quite allow me to do that if I merge Feminista with it, it allows me to do? And so that would be the question I would say to ask yourself. And then second, absolutely, the second special issue that's on Critical Race Feminista methodologies has a good piece in there.
Thank you.
Ruth Lopez. Sorry, I have her picture up there. I couldn't remember her last name. Ruth Lopez.
My. I just got goosebumps. Really appreciate you sharing so powerfully. And the way, Doctor, you focused on healing and disrupting some of the sort of colonial framings we have for our research, and reaching so deeply into the lives of these feminist thought leaders and amazing citizens. It makes me wonder if there are any conceptions around faith practice that surfaced in the conversation. It feels to me like it's there, but and I know I need to spend more time with your work, but anything you would mind sharing on that would be nourishing for me. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. And so when I said part of what is so provocative is the way that it has been queered, indigenized, decolonized. The other was spiritualized. So not so much in like organized religion. I'm not sure of anyone who kind of talks about it in that sense. But in the way that spirituality comes out over and over again, whether it's with college students and the way they survive and has to do with their spiritual connections and practices, whether it's around healing. I'm thinking of Shireen Hannigan-Martinez's work that is absolutely participants talk about the spiritual aspect in there. And to me, that's what, and when I, again, look back to that 98, like, how did I miss that? Because that was in my family. I know I had that, but I wasn't thinking of that yet. I'm actually going to ask Shireen just to say the name of the panel that follows this, because there's a panel that it's on healing, and pieces of that really is the spiritual process. Shireen, can you just say in the microphone where that session, where we're going for that session, and what the title is, or generally?
Thank you. The title is loosely Healing Racialized Trauma, Grief, and Love as a Praxis for Trauma-Informed Healing. And we are in 201B at 305.
Yeah.
Two more questions.
Okay. Hi. Hola. First of all, thank you for everything. You're truly inspirational. My name is Maria Ortiz. I am currently a doctoral student at CU Denver. And as I'm going through the process, I'm trying to figure out where I want to head to. I am an elementary school teacher. I love what I do. And just on a personal level, what inspired you or helped you transition? I know the importance of being in the classroom, being brown, being seen, hablando español, and so it's really difficult for me to step away from the classroom, but understanding that there is so much more to be done. And so I'm looking for maybe some words or a little bit of how you did that transition from an elementary school to where you're at now.
Well, when I started the doctoral program, I was a fifth grade elementary school teacher. And when I started it, I had no intention of going into academia. I didn't really even know what that meant, honestly. And I thought if I have a PhD behind my name, I would be able to, I would be listened, I was young, so I thought I would be listened to, because no one's listening to me right now, and there were some really racist practices. I was in Pasadena Unified, and not just Latino students, but Armenian students were getting punished for speaking their home language. And I thought, no one's listening to me, but if I have this degree, if I'm doctor or something, maybe they'll listen to me. So I was planning on going back to the classroom. On that journey, maybe it was some of the spaces where I found myself with colleagues, and the spaces in AERA didn't have the kind of program that Linda and Tyrone have put together, so it was very different back then. But finding those pockets of spaces somehow led me to that. And also, I think, in my mentor, Danny, I saw the journey that was like, oh, that's just another route. It may not be for everybody, but I learned that, yeah, I think I want to do that. And I enjoyed doing research, and I enjoyed the relationship and meeting these women and stuff. So I'm assuming it's just same for everyone, but I have to say, I was at the same place as you as a fifth grade elementary school teacher when I started, not at all thinking about academia. Yeah.
Final question.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So yeah, I'm one of those people still recovering.
I like that you're honest.
I am a faculty of ethnic and Black studies, but I'm also a first year completing my first year doctoral student at SF State. Thank you. But I'm really interested in this sort of resistance practice of like conversation and bringing that as data and research. I've been really exploring dialogue and things like that. I will also say that I won't say I suffer, but I have ADHD. And so I'm thinking about all of the informal conversations that I have that reveal so much. And also thinking about and juxtaposing that with the interviews and the sort of the traditional way of conducting research. And so I'm curious, this is more of like a methods structure. I'm curious on when you find yourself in those spaces of having those pláticas, right? How do you retain that information? Because for me, I'm so involved in the conversation as well, right? This is, depending on the amount of people they're giving, we're sharing, it's a very reciprocal process. But afterwards, it's sort of like, okay, there's no tape recorder. I'm not writing notes, right, to disrupt the flow. So I'm really curious on how do you, or like what happens after those conversations? How do you retain that knowledge and share it with your research as data?
Yeah, that's really important for all of us to think about because those informal spaces kind of become formal when you're taking notes, right? I do have to say, again, I'm going to direct you to the Pláticas special issue because there's scholars in there who are writing about how they engage in these kinds of pláticas. And so the kind of conversations that are happening here and there aren't recorded. But most of them are recording, even if it's two-way, it's relational, it's all those things I talk about, but they're very often recording them because of what you're saying. ADHD or not, right? It's just a lot. But I'm thinking of Juan Freire, who did his dissertation at Adelante at the elementary school, and he was doing pláticas constantly with bilingual, dual immersion bilingual teachers that he was working with. And so journaling was so important when you walk out of that elementary school site, because those pláticas were happening not with a protocol, but they were ongoing. And so it became so important to document, like literally sit in the parking lot at the school, taking some notes of here's the things that just happened. Because you're right, we all forget that. And so it depends the space you're in. But I do think most of the folks I've been reading are recording. And now because it is so easy, it's more comfortable, less formal than the old days when I had to bring a big old cassette player. It's just your phone, right? And people are so used to it. And once you've built some of those relationships, they're usually pretty open to that. So thank you. Thank you, folks. Really appreciate it.
Before we leave, I just want to say, show Dolores some love, please. So I've been doing selfies, so come on, Dolores. We got to reach out. Okay, everybody up so we can see you, okay? On three. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Pláticas. I just want to say real quick before we leave, I hope you all realize we just received a master class. It was a master class on methods, on theories, on cultural tuition. I just want to say, Dolores, thank you for doing the work that you do that allows us to be seen, that allows us to be whole, that allows us to be validated and affirmed. So much of this work, as you all know, we feel like we have to somehow separate ourselves from the work. We have to check our identities at the door. But your work has told us that we don't have to do that we can embrace our full selves, our total selves, and we are forever indebted for your work. It's so important, it's so inspirational, and just the impact you've had on myself and so many other scholars, it says a lot about who you are as a scholar. And as great of a scholar, you're a better person. We've had stories about kids and parenting and things of that nature. So let's make sure we give folks their flowers when we have them. Show her some more love. True scholar, true difference maker. Thank you, thank you, thank you.